So before the director makes his remarks, I just want to introduce the director's legal counsel on this review, Mark Sandler of Cooper, Sandler, Scheim, and Bergman Law Firm. And also I'd like to introduce Kate Forget, who is a lawyer with the Indigenous Justice Division of the Ministry of the Attorney General. Kate was seconded to our office for this review. Jerry McNeely is the Independent Police Review Director, and he's been in that position since the office opened in 2009. Jerry is a lawyer with a background in human rights law, family law, legal aid, and mediation. And following the director's remarks, we'll take questions from the media, and we ask that the media reporters identify their organization with their question. So Director McNeely.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, and thanks to Rosemary for the introduction. As Rosemary indicated, my name is Jerry McNeely. I'm Ontario's Independent Police Review Director. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting here on the traditional lands of the Fort William First Nation within the Robinson Superior Treaty territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and the Métis. I would also like to acknowledge a couple people here, in particular, Chief Collins of Fort William First Nation, who has given us permission to be here today. I would also like to acknowledge Chief Sylvie Holt, who is present here with us today. And I would like to thank all of you for coming this morning. My office, the Office of the Independent Police Review Director, provides oversight of police in Ontario. When my office opened in 2009, I soon became aware of the strained relationships between Thunder Bay Police Service and Indigenous people who live in Thunder Bay or traveled here for school or services. I raised this issue with the then Thunder Bay Police Chief on several occasions. The Chief committed to improving the relationship. In 2013, I convened a meeting between the Thunder Bay Police Service and Indigenous leaders and stakeholders to help facilitate an ongoing relationship. Although the service did undertake some initiatives to address the issue, I was unconvinced that the relationship improved appreciably. In 2015, an Indigenous man, Stacy DeBungie, from Rainy River First Nations, was found dead in the McIntyre River. Mr. DeBungie's family member and the then chief of Rainy River, Jim Leonard, who's here today, made complaints to my office about how Thunder Bay Police Service had investigated his death. I subsequently substantiated misconduct under the Police Services Act in regards to that particular case. Those proceedings remain ongoing today. The same complaints, in the same complaint, also describe a crisis of confidence in Indigenous communities in how the service was conducting its investigations into Indigenous sudden deaths and disappearances in Thunder Bay. This prompted them to ask my office to conduct a systemic review of the service. A systemic review does not find individual misconduct, but instead examines concerns more generally about the way the police conduct and carry out their duties and their work. A systemic review makes findings that support recommendations for change. The Chief and the Council of Rainy River First Nations were instrumental in pursuing for this systemic review. I would like to acknowledge their persistence in pursuing justice for their community member and Indigenous communities more generally. I would like to acknowledge Rainy River First Nations Chief Robert McGuinness, who is here today. My report, the report some of you had an opportunity to look at, Broken Trust, Indigenous people in the Thunder Bay Police Service is a accumulation of an extensive and unprecedented review and analysis of 37 Thunder Bay Police Services investigations involving sudden deaths, including cases deemed homicides, accidents, and suicides. Some of these cases were also addressed, although from a different perspective, at the coroner's inquest into the deaths of 7 First Nations youth held in Thunder Bay. Some of these cases also fall within the mandate of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Our review of individual cases involve what is called a paper review. A systemic review involves a paper review by a team with expertise in both legal issues, including human rights law, homicides, and sudden death investigations. A paper review involves a detailed examination of the documents in the police file or in the coroner's possession, including officers' notes, occurrence reports, interviews, photos, videos, and autopsy reports. We also interviewed a number of officers involved in some of the specific cases under consideration. This was done to determine if the police files told the whole story. Apart from case-specific interviews, we conducted numerous other interviews with former and current members of the service, including senior management, as well as the Ontario Chief Coroner, the Ontario Chief Forensic Pathologist, senior officers with First Nations Police Services, and the York Regional Police. The scope of this review is very large. The review identifies very significant deficiencies in how these investigations were being conducted by the service and addresses why these deficiencies exist. Apart from how specific cases were investigated, I felt it was important to examine the relationship between the service and Indigenous communities more generally. We explored the extent to which racism, whether characterized as systemic, overt, or intentional, unconscious, or deliberate, contributed to the difficult relationship between police and the Indigenous communities. We explored how any such racism or discrimination should be addressed going forward. These issues were discussed with many officers, past and current, and in intensive engagement with the community. My team and I visit Thunder Bay more than 2 dozen times and held more than 80 meetings with Indigenous and non-Indigenous community and service organizations, individuals, and Indigenous leaders. We also held a public meeting in Thunder Bay as part of the engagement process right here in this room. My report contains 44 recommendations. They address a wide range of topics. The vast majority are directed to Thunder Bay Police Service, although some are also directed to the offices of the Chief Coroner and the Chief Forensic Pathologist, as well as others. Clearly, I'm not going to go through all my findings and recommendations. We'll be here all day. They are there in the report for you to read. The report also contains an executive summary, but I do want to highlight some. And I'm going to first talk about Thunder Bay Police Service investigations and its operations. Then I will address racism. So let me talk about the investigations. I found that the efficiencies in how the Thunder Bay Police was investigating Indigenous sudden deaths were so problematic that I have recommended at least 9 of these cases should be reinvestigated by a multidisciplinary team. This team should include investigators from other police services, a coroner, and a forensic pathologist. The original investigators are not to be members of this multidisciplinary team. I say at least 9 cases, because we did not purport to examine every sudden death investigation. Accordingly, the multidisciplinary team should establish a protocol for determining whether other Thunder Bay Police Services sudden death investigations, including the other investigations I reviewed, should be reinvestigated as well. What were the deficiencies in Thunder Bay investigations we identified in the report? Specifically, a number of investigators lacked the expertise and the experience to conduct sudden death or homicide investigations. We saw frequent examples of officers who did not know what they did not know. These officers were given lead investigators' roles within the General Investigations Unit without adequate skills or training. Investigators repeatedly failed to recognize what constitutes a potential suspicious death, and that a sudden death must be investigated as a potential sudden death unless or until the evidence supports the contrary. They misunderstood when matters should be investigated under the major case management system. Interviews were often poorly conducted or not conducted at all. There were no meaningful oversight or supervision of investigators and investigations. At the same time, some investigative work was not adequately documented in police files. Pertinent information was not passed on between investigators. The misguided approach to investigations meant, in a number of sudden death cases, investigators did not embark on any meaningful investigation because they believed that there was no obvious signs of foul play. It also explained in part why officers came to premature conclusions about individual cases. Investigators regularly failed to connect the autopsy report to their own investigations. On multiple occasions, we saw that investigations failed to even find out the results of the autopsy, or failed to understand the significance or lack of significance of the autopsy findings. For example, officers concluded that death by drowning meant that the death was innocently caused, rather than investigating how the deceased came to be in the water. Similarly, death by hypothermia was interpreted to mean that the death was innocently caused, rather than investigating whether a third party was responsible for rendering the deceased incapacitated or unconscious. An integral part of a proper death investigation involves the forensic identification officer working together with the investigator, the pathologist, and the coroner in a coordinated way to ensure every death is explained, if possible, and investigated thoroughly. This did not always happen. Local coroners, as well as investigators, failed to understand their respective roles or even share a common understanding of those roles. These and other issues we identified were so profound that we brought them to the attention of the service and the chief coroner without awaiting the outcome of our final report. During our review, the chief coroner for Ontario led the development of a new framework to address the challenges and shortcomings in how the Thunder Bay Police Service, coroners, and pathologists are to work together in death investigations. I endorse this detailed framework and promote its use in every death investigation in Thunder Bay. The service has introduced some measures, including the Southern Death Review Committee, to address concerns identified in this report, and that's positive. But much more needs to be done. For example, inadequate resources are directed to serious investigations. It is unacceptable that a police service investigating a large number of serious complex cases has no major case management unit, and assigned investigators may lead the investigation of such cases without appropriate training or expertise. we must ensure going forward that sudden death investigations are adequately done so that confidence is restored in the Indigenous communities. Accordingly, I recommend that Thunder Bay Police Service should initiate an external peer review process of its investigations for at least 3 years following the release of this report today. This would mean that selected sudden death and homicide investigations would be peer reviewed by experienced investigators from outside police service. This would provide further support and expertise to Thunder Bay Police investigators in this regard. So now let me focus on the other part that I indicated, which is racism. I'll turn to this question, both in relation to investigations of Indigenous Southern deaths and more generally. The relationship between the Thunder Bay Police Service and Indigenous communities is, in my assessment, it is a broken one. While it is understood that much of the mistrust Indigenous people feel towards police is rooted in the history of colonialism, that does not in any way relieve Thunder Bay Police Service of its obligation to earn the trust of Indigenous people. In fact, it only creates a greater onus on the service to do so. Any police service must take the community it serves as it finds it and take the necessary measures to meet its unique needs. The police need the support of the community to do their job well. This is one of the foundational Pelian principles of policing. Therefore, it is essential that the police fulfill their duties in a manner that maintain public confidence. This is particularly the case when it comes to perceptions and the reality of racial discrimination. The police must not only do their jobs in a non-discriminatory manner, but the public must have confidence that this is the case. By that measure, Thunder Bay Police Service to date has not been successful in earning the confidence of Indigenous communities. When discussing issues of racism and making my determinations, I use terminology so we could all understand from the Ontario Human Rights Code and related jurisprudence. Racism, as defined, or racial prejudice, is a belief. It is a belief, sometimes unconsciously held, about the superiority of one racial group over another. It can be expressed at an individual, interpersonal level, or systematically at an institutional level. It is often manifested in stereotypes, in which people use racial categories to receive and understand information about others. Racial discrimination occurs when racial prejudice is a factor in how a person or an institution acts. It's often manifested in subtle and covert ways. Systemic discrimination occurs when an institution's culture, when the culture, the structure, or the practices create or perpetuate disadvantage for persons or groups. Subjective intent to treat someone unequally is not required to prove racial discrimination. Rather than merely searching for direct evidence of overt racist statements or actions, we all must consider whether there's circumstantial evidence of racial discrimination. Based on these points and these principles I outlined in my report for analyzing racial discrimination, I found that in my review of cases, Thunder Bay Police Service investigators, they failed on an unacceptably high number of occasions to treat or protect the deceased and his or her family equally and without discrimination because the deceased was Indigenous. Investigators too readily presumed accident in cases of Indigenous sudden deaths. They relied upon evidence of drowning or hypothermia as if it virtually determined that the death was accidental. They placed extraordinary weight on the deceased's level of intoxication as if it virtually determined that the death was accidental. They failed to take even the most basic investigative steps in a number of sudden death cases. They ignored evidence potentially pointing to a non-accidental cause or contribution to the death. Some attempts to explain the deficiencies in the investigation by references, some attempted to explain the deficiencies in the investigations by reflecting and referencing their workload as well as a lack of training and resources. In my view, these explanations cannot fully account for the failings that my team and I observed, given their nature and severity. The failure to conduct adequate investigations and the premature conclusions drawn in these cases, at least in part, attributed to racial stereotyping. Racial stereotyping involves transforming individual experiences into generalized assumptions about an identifying group defined by race. We observed this process of generalization based on race in a number of the investigations we reviewed. Officers repeatedly relied on generalized notions about how Indigenous people likely came to their deaths and acted or refrained from acting based on those biases. This does not represent a determination that all Thunder Bay Police Service officers engage in intentional racism, no. However, the fact remains that investigations were too often handled differently because the deceased was Indigenous. As I indicated earlier, I also examined the issue of racism more broadly. That is, beyond how sudden death investigations were conducted. In this regard, we conducted 36 interviews with Thunder Bay Service members in the course of our review. We encountered a wide range of beliefs and attitudes. Some expressed very disturbing views. While these views were expressed by a minority of officers, they were expressed by more than just a bad few apples. We also heard from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous community members who described troubling attitudes, statements, and actions by officers. Overall, I found that systemic racism exists in Thunder Bay Police Service at an institutional level. The Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate described systemic racism as occurring when an institution maintains racial inequality or provides inequitable outcomes. It is often caused by hidden institutional biases in policies, in practices, and in processes that privilege or disadvantage people based on race. This can be unintentional and doesn't necessarily mean that people within the organization are racist. It can be the result of doing things the way they've always been done, without considering how they impact particular groups differently. People make up institutions. When those people adopt or ignore inequalities, it leads to an outcome of systemic racism. I made a number of recommendations in relation to racism, including that Thunder Bay Police Service focus proactively on actions to eliminate systemic racism. In a report that is sharply critical of the service, I also acknowledge that the service has taken a number of important initiatives to address these issues. These initiatives are described in detail in the report and should be commended. In my view, my recommendations represent crucial additional steps to eliminate racism and build a healthy relationship with Indigenous communities for all of us to move forward. Excuse me. I recommend that Thunder Bay Police Service leadership publicly and formally acknowledge that racism exists at all levels within the police service and that it will not tolerate racist views or actions. The Thunder Bay Police Services Board should also publicly and formally acknowledge that racism exists within Thunder Bay Police Service and take a leadership role in repairing the relationship between Thunder Bay Police Service and Indigenous communities. These are important steps in Thunder Bay Police Service advancing reconciliation with Indigenous people. Senator Murray Sinclair was tasked to report on the Police Services Board, and I did not intend my report to preempt his work. But I also recommended that Thunder Bay Police Service leadership create a permanent advisory group involving the police chief and Indigenous leadership with a defined mandate so that they have regular meetings and a mechanism for crisis-driven meetings. I facilitated one such meeting during my systemic review. I addressed the need for mandatory Indigenous competency training for all officers and employees. I addressed that need for it to be developed in partnership with Indigenous communities. This training should be ongoing throughout the careers, should not stop. Psychological testing has been developed elsewhere with specifically designed to eliminate applicants for employment as police officers who have or express racist views. Although it's not currently used in Ontario, it should be implemented in Thunder Bay on a priority basis. This will show good leadership. The service should also, on a priority basis, create and adopt a proactive strategy to increase diversity within its ranks. Job promotion within the service should be linked to demonstrated Indigenous cultural competency. This means, among other things, that questions posed at promotional interviews should include Indigenous content. I've also recommended an expanded Aboriginal liaison unit with added responsibilities. These, folks, are only some of the key recommendations contained in the report. In closing, I am indebted to those community members and organizations who have shared their views freely as to how the Thunder Bay Police Service can move forward in a respectful way to improve its relationship with Indigenous communities. For many Indigenous people, this is a painful exercise. The serious inadequacies and premature conclusions in Thunder Bay Police Service investigations of Indigenous missing people and persons and sudden deaths have strained what was already a deeply troubled relationship. My recommendations provide tools to help Thunder Bay Police Service ensure that its investigations are thorough, effective, and non-discriminatory. My recommendations also provide Thunder Bay Police Service with a path forward to improve its relationship with Indigenous people. I would like to acknowledge and pay tribute to those officers, former and present, who care about how Thunder Bay Police Service serves in the Indigenous communities and support initiatives to promote anti-racist and effective policing. It gives me great cause for hope that Thunder Bay Police Service has begun initiatives to address these issues. As I said earlier, while that is positive, there's much more that needs to be done. Indeed, I will monitor and report to the public the extent to which my recommendations are implemented. The community is entitled to no less. That represents my commitment to Indigenous people, Thunder Bay Police Service, and the broader community it is responsible for serving. Thank you, Miigwech.
identify yourself. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jorge Barrera with CBC. In your report, you mentioned the grassroots committee findings about, not more than a handful of 18, but it may have been up to like 30 death cases involving Indigenous peoples, and they were concerned back then about racism. You're calling for 9. You had a limited number of cases you reviewed. Given the historical facts and reality of this and the institutional racism that you said was identified, how deep can or could this go? And I want to follow up too, but I'm just wondering, how deep could this be? If we're going back 20 years and the same things are said back then.
That's a really good question, so thank you. In the report, we made it clear, I recommended that there be a multidisciplinary committee established, and I've given you a sense of the makeup of that the committee. And I believe that should be up to that committee to determine how deep they're going to go. They're going to take a look at cases, those 9 cases I've recommended, plus the other cases that I reviewed, and there are many other cases. But I think that committee, that multidisciplinary committee, will be well placed to determine how far and how deep the review should go.
How does what you found about the Thunder Bay Police in terms of the systemic racism you said you found compare to other police forces in Ontario? Is what you found here particularly different, unique, worse? I'm just wondering, how does this compare to other police agencies?
Well, I only looked in this regard at Thunder Bay Police Service at this time. I'll be sending my report out to all of the police services in Ontario, and I hope that they will all pay attention to them, especially those communities, those police services that police Indigenous communities.
But you deal with police services all the time with complaints, and what you're seeing here, do you see that anywhere else in terms of the rate of it, the details of it, the hostility you say that you saw from individual officers? That's not just a few bad apples. Is this comparable to any place else in the province in terms of the complaints you've received in your office?
Well, I've done a systemic review on Thunder Bay, so I've looked deeply into those issues you've just raised. I have not had the availability or the opportunity to do a similar study of other services. And as you know, part of my role is we receive individual complaints from across the province, some 3,400 of them annually. And in those individual complaints, sometimes we have similar issues raised. I think it's a great move and a great opportunity for moving forward. I know Selena, and she's well experienced, she's highly motivated, and she cares about her Indigenous community and the Thunder Bay community at large. And so I think it's a very, very positive move. It is a great opportunity to build on the recommendations of my report on a go-forward basis. So I am hopeful that she would provide good leadership, not just to the board, but to the police service to enhance its relationship with the Thunder Bay Indigenous community.
How about getting more Indigenous people on the boards?
Well, you know, it's a great question. It may be best put to the government of the day, but I think it's a very positive move. Firstly, to have an Indigenous member on the board, and secondly, for her to be named the chair of the board. And I think it's positive, and hopefully that would propel others to want to become involved in policing at that level.
Since you've been gone, a number of things have taken place in the community, and more recently, Braden Jacob has died when he was here for mental health services, trauma counseling. And then there was an incident with a young girl who was assaulted by a police officer while strapped to a gurney while she was in distress. And the police issued a media release, and the language that they used, I found really problematic, because they said that this officer is now receiving medical attention as if it was on an ongoing basis.
Is that mental issues?
But potentially, I don't know, but what I found really problematic about the way that they positioned that is that Indigenous people are unclean as a general rule. And it was a microaggression, yes, but it was also something that an official authority with power and like an unfair distribution of power in their favor against the child. To me, I found it really problematic, but it also made me really angry, and I felt insulted as an Indigenous woman, as a person living in this community. And I don't think that it is fair or right that they continue to do this to our people. And I wanted to stop. Like, and like, my cousin was murdered here in June about a year and a half ago, and no one's been charged in his killing. And like, as a family, we still struggle with that. And like, the relationship between the investigating officers and my family is very fractured. They only talk to the father but not the mother, but they're not together. And when you have a death of a child, even an adult child in a family, I mean, like, it causes more strains. And so like the way that my family is treated, like even in the context of that investigation, is unequal. And the mother can't come to Thunder Bay. She's on my reserve. She gets panic attacks, like she hyperventilates. She has to be on medication just to come into this city, because this city represents death and fear and hate. And it's very real for her. And I don't think people realize enough how fucking serious this situation is.
Well, you know,
Are there timelines for all of these deliverables? What kind of, like, is there a mechanism to enforce them? Is there a way to issue sanctions against them if they don't do what they were asked to do? And if they don't do it well, how do we get protection from them? Because they have lots of protections, but we don't.
So firstly, I wanted to say that we're sorry for your and your family loss. And also the other incidents you have raised are of concern and needs to be looked at and taken seriously, and I am hopeful that that will be done. My recommendations is a great opportunity to try to move forward in this regard. My recommendations are specifically geared to and addresses the issues that this young lady has raised today, and how the service and how the indigenous community could start to move forward, how they can start to have acknowledgements, and how they can start on a reconciliation path to move forward, so that concerns as the ones expressed and the views and the hurt that people experience through these processes will somehow be eradicated or reduced. So that's the thrust of the recommendations we have made in this report. Look, I've indicated in the report that I expect and I'm hopeful that the chief and her service and the board, and the chief is here, that they would immediately go about implementing the recommendations in my report, because that is the start of moving forward. That is the start of acknowledgement, and that is the start of reconciliation. I'm hoping that would happen. I've asked for reports back. I've set some timelines, and I will be looking at it. And I intend to publish responses or lack of responses. I'm going to be positive, and I say I will get responses. I anticipate that the chief will do the right thing, and the right thing is implementing the recommendations, those 44 recommendations we've made in our report. So I'm looking forward to that.
Are there any more questions from the media? Media?
Over there.
Media?
Your report did touch on social media and formal and traditional media a little bit. Would you like to expand on your thoughts of the media and the public's response when Indigenous deaths happen in the city?
Well, we touched on it because, you know, social media is a factor now in our society. We live by media, so information and news and occurrences moves around very quickly as opposed to how it did in the past. So I encourage the use of social media. I encourage it to bring information and attention to the powers to be. I encourage young people to use it to think positively so we can move forward and to address the issues that we're talking about here today, but in a positive way, so that social media can in fact and should in fact be used very positively to make life better, lives better for all of us.
Do you find the reactions of both social media and traditional media to be abnormal or different from other places when these types of things happen?
I can't say I find that. I think every community has its different way of communicating issues, and I think social media is being used more effectively in some areas than the traditional media. But I think in a combined way, we're getting the messages, we're getting the information, and hopefully that would lead us to want to do something to make it right.
Any other media?
I'll hand over my questions to the ladies.
Sorry, media?
From Net News Ledger.
Okay.
Thunder Bay Police and the City of Thunder Bay have put some projects together, the Walk a Mile Project and other issues. When the Thunder Bay Police were at the Walk a Mile Project for training, it created some hassles and problems. Do you feel in your investigation that the Thunder Bay Police have taken the issues seriously as they could? And do you feel that they're now going to take it more seriously?
Well, I'm hoping now that everything we've done today and said today and all my recommendations will be taken extremely seriously. We spent 2 years doing this work and making those recommendations in a very careful manner for an organization like the Thunder Bay Police Service and the Indigenous community to move forward. In regards to the initiatives being undertaken, I know that the Chief is undertaking a number of initiatives, and that's quite positive. As I've indicated, I encourage it. And I encourage more inclusiveness with the Indigenous community, from cultural understandings and competencies on a go-forward basis. So Walk a Mile was just one of those things. There were some hiccups in it, but you know, that happens and it makes us go back and regroup and come back and be stronger in regards to how we can teach, bring about teachings and learnings so that issues of differential treatment and racism are moved away.
Now, you spoke about timelines. What kind of timelines are you looking at? Are you looking at quarterly reviews, semi-annual reviews? What can you share with us?
Well, I've asked in the report, I indicated that I like some feedback in 6 months. I've also indicated about 1 year, and it's something I'm going to be monitoring, as I've indicated. I think the issues in Thunder Bay needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed urgently. And I'm going to want to keep involved to assist in that urgent way that these matters should be addressed and dealt with. So my timelines are laid out in my report, and I'm going to adhere to those, and I hope and expect that the Chief and her service will do so also.
Temporary police brutality coordinator. What I discovered as a police brutality coordinator was that the police service bodies did not understand their investigation jurisdictions within the police service, the various bodies. When we have a rape case where it is bucked off to Shabaasky or APS, and they have to bring it back to Thunder Bay Police. And what I also understood was that frontline agencies did not understand their total PSA relationship understanding of the Police Services Act, which is why I recommended last year that the PSA be applied to also First Nations policing bodies. Last year, I understood because I also lost a member to the street, John Bottle. His death was not investigated thoroughly. I had to act in a way that was professional. I understood the police beatings that they got by our political leaders. I understood that the conversation needed to happen between the police services bodies and the citizens of Thunder Bay. It took 4 months to get every police service body to agree to sit with the city. It was supposed to be scheduled for
something happened within the political organization of NAN. I was removed from that position by one of my political leaders. We need to engage and we need to rebuild that discussion with every policing service inspector and every police body in the city, including the OIPRD, including the SIU, forensic and pathologists. We need to have that conversation with you without political interference of chiefs. And we also need to have a grassroots response to what is happening. I stopped counting. Came back in 2011. I stopped counting at 87 deaths at that time. That's a lot of deaths on the street. So I'm asking political leaders and those that actually want to contribute change, reignite this conversation, this community conversation. What was supposed to happen was that every police service body was going to present for an hour. Then they were going to engage in a discussion for an hour with the citizens and people in the city, so that we understood and we can get to the same page, so that we understood and how can develop those paths forward as a community. I'm saying this because I am an urban grassroots representative. I'm also an Indigenous rights activist. I'm not afraid to speak against our own people. Our own people are also responsible in severing this conversation. And we, as grassroots citizens here, we as officer members are not represented by political chiefs, officers. We are represented by the Urban Aboriginal Board and whatever agencies that serve to represent us. Our services are 4-month backlog. There is so much mental health issues that the frontline officers have to deal with. And we need to figure out a way how we can address that relationship. How can we access and advocate for those services that they need as police officers, because they are not mental health service workers. Rich?
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. And
Just one more question from the media,
Thunder Bay
thanks.
Police Chief just released a statement, and in it...
say that again? I'm
The
sorry.
Thunder Bay Police Chief just released a statement, and in nowhere does it say anything about racism. It talks about systemic barriers in policing. I'm just wondering, you know, my understanding is they had this report ahead of time, they've read it, they're still talking about analyzing this, but they're talking about barriers. I'm just wondering what your response is to their initial reaction to this.
Well, yeah, I haven't had the privilege of reading the statement, and I appreciate you advising us what it states. And I can tell you this. This report provides an opportunity for the police service and the Indigenous community and other communities to get together to move forward. We've made explicit recommendations in that regard. We talk about the formation and the creation of a joint committee, not just to review cases, but a committee for the chief of police and Indigenous leadership and others to get together and to start to talk to move forward. And I hope that that's what will happen coming out today. I would like to say that today it should be the first day. I mean, and I know folks have heard this before, but let this try to make this a real first day of moving forward, a real first day of making a difference, a real first day of trying to do something different so that the situation in Thunder Bay that exists now will go away. Let us make this jointly a first day. Let us be positive, let's think positively, and let's all do the right thing to make it better, especially for the young people.
And if the police don't change, is there time to put the replacement of the Thunder Bay Police Force on the table? Like, is it time to replace the police force? I mean, this is their initial reaction. I wonder if that's an option that should be looked at.
Well, again, I haven't had the privilege, and I'm a lawyer, and I like to read things myself. And I'm not denying what you have indicated, but I would like to look at it, and I would like an opportunity to understand it, and I would obviously like to have an opportunity to address that with the appropriate authorities.
Okay, thanks, folks. That's it for now. Jerry?
Thank you.
I'd like to make a comment about the young lady. About the young lady's comment here about the police being protected. And she said that the officer, the incident happened there a couple days ago about how the police got health issues. So what's that mean, health issues? You got mental health issues? do all the police have mental health issues? And about the recommendations about the 3-year deal. I don't think that's long enough, because 3 years went by and still, things are still the same. Nothing hasn't changed. So when's change gonna happen?
Thanks for sharing.
Hello, Mr. McNally. Please give me a moment.
Well, you do it privately.
Pardon? Privately?
Yes.
Well, I'm not allowed to speak.
Not a member of the meeting.
I'm a direct stakeholder because my daughter's file was pulled from the Thunder Bay Police Department to do a review, with your review, the outcome in this book, about non-Indigenous people. And my daughter was 15 years old, and my question is, and I've been kept quiet for 5 years now, and you guys are well aware of this, but I want to know